But today, we're here as the HDR team that contracted with the State Water Commission this past fall to develop the life cycle cost analysis and economic analysis that in both instances were mandated by the legislature. I've been the project manager for the HDR group, and with me today is Jeremy Cook. Jeremy is a senior economist with HDR, and also Dr. Jay Leach, who is a former professor at North Dakota State University, who was a part of our team that put together the two models. Our whole purpose here today is to go through the two models, explain how they work, and answer any questions that you have, so that as you bring forward projects and they're analyzed, either as a life cycle cost analysis or economic analysis, you'll understand the workings behind the models and of course, the results that come out of the models. Out of curiosity, how many people here today are, local officials, water resource district managers, or city officials? Okay, about half a dozen or so. How many are consultants for communities or rural water systems? Okay, so the rest. So I'm assuming we've got probably about 75–80% engineers in the audience, and about 25% other. So I wanted to do this little survey so I could give both Jay and Jeremy an idea of who they're talking to today. And the one thing we encourage all of you throughout the presentations today is to ask questions. At any point, if you got a question, just raise your hand, and we'll try to answer that question. And we're going to begin this morning with a presentation by Jeremy and Jay on economics and why we do the things that we do in regards to public infrastructure and economics. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jeremy and Jay.
Jay, you're going to be leading this off. Oh, that's really loud. One other thing, if you do have questions as we go through this, a matter of housekeeping, we have a second mic. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and we'll actually get the mic to you because we are recording this. So you can voice your question, but we want to make sure we get it recorded here. So.
Is my mic working? Is it? How is it working? So now it's working. Hey, it's working. Okay. They never let me teach freshman or sophomore classes at NDSU because I couldn't stay on track. So bear with me this morning if we go off track a few times, but that's what makes life interesting. I wrote a book about I use analogies once in a while. I wrote a book about catfishing a couple of years ago, and it only takes 2 pages to write about catfishing. So I filled the rest of it up by putting catfishing in context. And when we talked about this workshop, it doesn't take very long to show you how to use the models that we built. You punch in some numbers. But I wanted to put those models in a bigger social economic context, government context, of why we're doing it in the first place and how all of that works. So bear with me for a little while we develop that context around which you will be doing efficiency analysis. The role of government. Government has 4 roles. Efficiency, and efficiency has 2 definitions. One is you take the pile of resources that government has available to it today, and you get as much output as you possibly can. That's one measure of efficiency. Another measure of efficiency, you determine this is what you want, and you use the lowest amount of resources you can. That's efficiency. Pretty simple. Get the most out of this, or use the least to get that. That's what efficiency is. And that's basically what life cycle cost analysis is going to show you, is that we want to use the least amount of resources that we can to accomplish our objective of providing municipal or rural water. Another role of government is equity, and equity is the distribution of income. Now there's some fun lectures there, but we're not going to talk about that today because that's a role of the federal government. The state can't do too much about equity. If you're interested in equity or the distribution of income, just Google Gini, G-I-N-I, coefficient. the Gini coefficient goes from 0 to 1. 0 means that everybody is equal. Everybody has the same amount of wealth. And 1 means one person has it all and the rest of it don't have anything. So look at the Gini coefficient, and when you see people on the 6 o'clock news say, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Well, look up the Gini coefficient and see if that's true. Gini, G-I-N-I, it's kind of interesting. Stability is another role of government. Again, that's a federal role, deals with the money supply, interest rates, and things like that to stabilize the economy so we don't have a bunch of ups and downs. States can't do much there. Growth, that may be a role of all governments, but when I think growth, I don't just think growth in the quantity of things, I also think growth in the quality of things. The cities of Bismarck and Mandan could grow without having any more people if the quality of life improved every year. So there's different ways of looking at growth. But the thing that we were charged with is efficiency, and efficiency is what state government's primary role is, the efficient use of resources. Economics, every one of you needs to remember this. Economics is a study of how individuals, firms, organizations, groups, governments allocate their scarce resources, and I'll talk about resources next, among competing uses to satisfy unlimited wants. That's what economics is. How do we sort out our resources to satisfy our unlimited wants? And every one of you has unlimited wants. Some of you want new cars and new clothes and new things. Other of you want clean water and clean air and more wolves and more bald eagles. They're unlimited wants. They all take resources. How do we allocate our limited resources to get those, satisfy those unlimited wants? There's 4 resources that a society has to allocate to get to those unlimited wants, and they are land, and land is all living and non-living endowments of the earth that are used or could be used to satisfy man's desires. So it includes water and trees and birds and oil, and all natural resources are captured under land. Labor, that's people, labor. Capital with a K, that's how economists spell capital. That means computers and technology and buildings and equipment and infrastructure. We have that capital to deal with. And the 4th one is entrepreneurship, the skills to put those previous 3 together in a way to meet our competing uses to satisfy our unlimited demands. Those are the 4 resources society has, and in each time period, we have a fixed amount of those. Now, in the next time period, if we have some improvements in technology or discovery or exploration, we may have more resources. But in this time period, there's a fixed amount. We want to use that fixed amount efficiently to either get the biggest pile we can, and in that pile, remember, is eagles and wolves and clean air and clean water, as well as Teslas and speedboats and jet skis. All of those things are in there. Some of you like some, others like others, and that's part of the role of government, is sorting that out. So those are our 4 resources. Okay, now it gets kind of... Economists talk in 3 different languages. We use words. Most of us understand that. I know some of the old engineers in the room have a little trouble understanding that. I'm not looking at Spry, but he and I kind of grew up together in this water business. I've been doing it for 42 years, and he's been doing it maybe a couple of years longer than that, so we can pick on each other. We use words. Another thing we use is graphs. And if you take economics classes in the first class, it's a lot of words and a few graphs. And the further you go in an economics curriculum, the more graphs you get, and then the more math you get. We won't use too much math here today. And the mathematics involved in efficiency analysis is really simple arithmetic. There's nothing very complicated. So we'll try to keep the language pretty straightforward. And since everybody sat in the back,
Here come the graphs.
society's production function. And this is all relevant. Okay, you can take it home and talk to your significant other about what you learned today. or this goofy economist. Remember, we got this pile of resources, okay? It's a fixed pile. Now we could talk about renewable and non-renewable, but we won't, that's another lecture. If we used all of those resources, we're gonna just produce two things in our economy. When you folks had Economics 101, what two things did you produce? Come on, somebody. Well, back when I took it, it was guns or butter. I don't know what they teach anymore.
Same for me. It was guns and butter.
Okay.
This would have been 15
Widget A and widget
18
B.
years ago.
But only a two-good economy, one of those goods is going to be bread. And bread can be a proxy for all of our food. If we use that whole pile of resources to produce bread on the y-axis, we could get that much bread. So this is bread. If we use all of those resources, we could produce that much bread. Spry, you know the y-axis, right? Okay. So see, he was in the Army. In the Army, you direct your instructions to the slowest guy in the unit, and if that guy gets it, you know everybody else did. So we'll use Spry. As long as he's nodding, we're doing okay. Okay, then there's the y-axis, and on the y-axis, we're gonna produce bunnies.
X.
X-axis. Okay, this is the y, this is the x.
Yep.
Now I could just flip this up and make that the y.
Yeah, exactly. These charts can be flipped.
Bunnies represent environmental goods, clean air, clean water. Now, we can use all of those resources and all of our technology. If we produce all buns, we can produce this much, all bunnies. But if we produce a mixture of buns and bunnies, there's a curve called the production possibilities curve. With those resources, we could also produce that many buns and that many bunnies, that many bunnies and that many buns. Those are all possible if we use all of our resources efficiently. If we use them wastefully, we'll be somewhere inside the production possibilities curve where we don't want to be. That's an inefficient use of resources. Now, Jeremy could do all kinds of fancy math with the production function, but I don't get that stuff.
We'll leave that off today.
Okay, so in this morning's life cycle cost, all we're looking at is the production function, is the costs. This afternoon, we're also going to talk about the outputs. And I'll give you a little clue about that. Most of you will probably be here. This is what we can produce. But what do we want to produce? And government sort of sorts that out. You see on the 6 o'clock news, you know, one side wants something and the other side wants a wall and who knows what. But there is another set of curves called society's indifference curve. This is what society wants. Along this curve, now you just have to trust me on this, okay? Along this curve, society would be equally happy with this many buns and this many bunnies, or this many buns and this many bunnies. They're indifferent. But right here is what we can do. We can't be here because we can only produce this much. We can't be here. Right here is our target. That is maximum social well-being. That's government's role. That's your role as consultants to government, is to maximize the use of these resources to enhance and get the most you can out of our pile. Maximum social welfare. There's a whole family of these indifference curves. You want to be on the highest one possible. You don't want to be over here because you could be here and that's on a higher curve. Maximum social welfare, using our resources efficiently to produce the goods and services that society wants. That's why we're here. Questions? You with me, Spry? Okay, Spry's still with us. Buns and bunnies, okay. Next, life cycle cost analysis. That's simply LGU's, local government units, or whatever government units way of finding the least cost method. Here's what we want. We want to get this water supply. How do we use the fewest amount of resources? Let's see, less and fewest. Less as if it's intensity, and fewest as if you can count. Anyway, how to use the lowest amount of resources to get that output. That's what LCCA is about.
And as economists, when we talk resources, at least in this case for LCCA, we're measuring everything in dollars. So when we say fewest amount of resources, we're talking federal funds, local dollars, whatever your monies are that you're putting into to construct a water supply project.
Yeah, and I woke up too early this morning thinking of all kinds of things I needed to say, but it's hard to cram 42 years into 20 minutes. We measure things in dollars. We don't have to. We could measure things in chair equivalents, in rubles, in cows. You know, other societies, the Zulus measure wealth in terms of cattle. We use dollars because it's convenient.
People understand it. People understand it. It's a common metric that everyone can relate to.
Dollars have no value in and of themselves. Dollar just represents how many of those resources the person that has the dollars controls. So they represent the amount of resources. We use dollars to do that. It gets a little tricky when we talk about real and nominal, but I'll talk about that in a second. Okay. What is life cycle? Process for evaluating total economic costs of a water project over time. So we're in the present, and the water project, we might have a whole bunch of costs up front, but we might also have costs in year 20, year 40, and how do we bring those costs back to the present? Analysis of initial costs and discounted future costs. Okay. That gets us real interesting side here. We use a discount rate to discount future values to the present. Now, if the costs, if this is the stream of costs, nominal dollars, in other words, today it costs $100, and in 25 years it's going to cost $100, and in 50 years it's going to cost $100. $100 50 years from now isn't the same as $100 today, is it? Good, because if you said it was, I'd have you give me $100 today, and I'd give it back in 50 years. That's why we discount $100. Here, for example, 2.875, that's the current federal discount rate. And that's the rate I recommend that we use in all of these projects. In 25 years, at 2.875%, a dollar is only worth 49 cents today. In 50 years, a dollar is only worth 24 cents today. Now, if we used a 6% discount rate, in 25 years, a dollar is only worth 23 cents. The higher the discount rate, the less a future value is worth. In 50 years, it's only worth 5 cents. Or if you took 5 cents today and put it in the bank, at 6%, you'd have a dollar in 50 years. At 10%, a dollar in 25 years is only worth 9 cents, and in 50 years, only worth less than a penny. That's why we discount things from nominal to real dollars. We ignore inflation. Don't anybody ask, what about inflation? We ignore inflation. Inflation is not a factor in what we're doing. Unless you think something is going to inflate in cost more than something else. But we just ignore inflation.
We've simplified that for now.
Yes, we've assumed it away.
And real quick, too, we are talking, a lot of these concepts are covered in the guidance. So right now we're talking about discounting, and there is a section on discounting in the guidance that goes through, that shows the equation of how we get to these values. So.
I can do that. The present value of the cost equals the cost in year 1 over 1 plus the discount rate raised to the 1 power plus the cost in year 2 over 1 plus the discount rate raised to the 2nd power, blah, 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 over cost in year 50 over 1 plus the discount rate raised to the 50th power. If you add all those up, this is the number you get. You multiply the flow by 17 at 2.875%, and that gives you the area under the curve, which is the present value of that.
We said we weren't going to do any math.
I'm sorry. Well, that's easy. That's just simple arithmetic. You can all do those in your head. Let's see, where are we?
The expected life of the project. So in this case, we're using a period of analysis because these are water supply projects. They have long lifespans. We're assuming 50 years here.
Some folks in Fargo-Moorhead want to do a 500-year project, but imagine if it's 6% at 50 years, it's only worth a nickel. what it's worth at 500 years. You know, beyond 50 years, it isn't even worth considering. And there's something called adaptive management, that you assume that if a township road washes out every year and the feds don't come in to fix it, you can't assume that it's going to wash out every year for the next 50 years. The township is going to adapt and fix it themselves so that things will happen. Fargo-Moorhead has taken out 200 houses out of the floodplain. So the without project condition isn't the status quo. Things change. I got off on a tangent.
And I would just add to that too, that as far as period of analysis and life of a project goes too, it's very rare. Like the Corps of Engineers used to, and even like NRCS, other federal agencies, and the P&G used to look at 100 years as kind of a life of a project. And even that is viewed extreme now. Like it's very rare anymore that you do anything over 50 years, just because even 100 years is unpredictable and the values are discounted so far that with adaptive management, you just can't predict what 100 years would look like anymore.
And if you're comparing alternative A to alternative B to alternative C, it doesn't really matter what your period of analysis is, as long as it's the same for every alternative.
Yep.
Economic versus financial analysis. Economics is the study of how we allocate scarce resources among competing uses to satisfy unlimited wants, how we allocate these resources to be efficient. Efficiency analysis. Financial analysis is, okay, who's going to pay for it? If I'm going to buy a quarter section of land, I pencil it out to see if it makes economic sense to buy that. And if I say, yes, it does, then I go to the bank and see if they'll give me a loan. That's financial analysis. The difference between economics, does it make sense from an economic perspective? And from government's perspective, does it make sense? Is it a wise use of these resources? The financial analysis, that's just how are we going to pay for it? Are we going to do a revenue bond, a general obligation bond? Are we going to beg the federal government for money? Are we going to make the users pay for it? That's financial analysis.
So like bonding, rate studies, ability to pay analysis, all of that's your financial stuff.
Yep.
So like when we're thinking life cycle cost analysis, an issue of a bond doesn't come into play here. That's financials. We're not worried about that. You want to talk to this figure, or you want me to?
You can talk to that one.
Okay. So when we think about life cycle costs in practice here, Jay was just talking about nominal costs versus real costs here. If you think about the life cycle of a project, you have your initial acquisition and construction of a project, and that's this large bump right here initially, right? You spend a lot of money up front to construct a project. Then, after construction, you go into your initial operations and maintenance phase. And initially, your O&M costs are low, and as wear and tear happens, your annual O&M might increase. It might be flat, or it might increase here. And then eventually, you hit a phase where you have to start doing some rehabilitation. That could be replacement of pipes, your pumps need to be replaced or upgraded, and then so you have another round of costs that you have to incur. They're not as large as the initial upfront costs, but nonetheless, they're a larger cost and they're out of cycle of your regular O&M. And then you get back into another maintenance phase. And because you've done your rehab, your O&M is back down, and then eventually those costs creep up over time. And it's not just due to a wear and tear, but it could also be just due to inflation. So your costs are going up, and then you hit another rehab phase, and so on and so forth. And eventually, you reach the end of the project's life cycle, and you dispose of the project. So you're going to have some salvage value. You're going to decommission buildings, and that's going to be your end of life of the project. So that's in nominal dollars. And getting back to that issue of discounting then, if we take all of those costs and we think about how discounting plays in here, you're going to have your initial upfront acquisition of the project, and then those O&M costs, even though they're increasing over time, are going to be discounted to present value. And that's what we're going to look at in terms of a stream of costs. And so our present value cost in a life cycle cost analysis is the sum of all of these discounted costs in each of the years that they occur.
Some of these sticky concepts in economics, present value is one, getting your brain around that. Elasticities is another one, which we're not going to talk about, but it sometimes takes a while for present value discussion to set in. Some of the notes that I made this morning when I got up. There's an argument that I heard not too long ago. Let's build it today because it's going to cost more tomorrow. That's not true. The nominal cost may be more tomorrow, but the real cost may not be anymore. In the construction sector, if you build a bridge today or 10 years from now, using the same methods, it's going to cost the same. Now, nominally the price will be higher, but the real cost will be the same. The only things that will increase the cost of the bridge are technology. If there's some new technology that you put in the bridge that costs more money to make it a better bridge, and regulation. If government says you got to put 12-foot side rails on the bridge. So technology and regulation may change the cost of construction, but you don't build it today because it's going to cost more in the future. That's not an argument. I heard that the other day, some old guy, I'm on the Buffalo Red watershed. Why didn't we build this in 1950 when it was only $1 million? Well, I got on my consumer price index, and $1 million in 1950, you know how much that is today? $10 million. Same amount. You can buy the same stuff with $10 million today that you could with $1 million in 1950. So the price is exactly the same. So there was no reason to build it in 1950 because it costs the same today. And I'm tired of hearing that argument. We got to build it now because it's going to cost more in the future. No, it's not going to cost more in the future, except for technology increases and regulatory increases. Where are we going? LCA captures all costs now and in the future. From the government perspective, from society's perspective, we include all the costs to whomever, wherever, whenever. Our perspective in this project is the state of North Dakota. We don't care about Nebraska or Florida or Canada. We care about the state of North Dakota. If something is done in Billings County that has an impact on somebody in Eddy County, from a state perspective, that needs to be considered. So the state is our perspective, not the federal government or not Billings County.
So, expanding on that, in the life cycle cost analysis framework and in the model that you have in front of you, the way this works is from a life cycle cost analysis, there's the initial construction costs. So that should include all of your costs to construct the project, including construction, real estate, planning, engineering, design, construction management, all of those different aspects, your contingency, all of that gets entered into your initial construction costs. Then you're going to go into your operations and maintenance phase, and we've simplified that in the model. We'll get into that in a few minutes here. Then there's your repair and rehabilitation cycles, and then your end-of-life costs. And the sum of those, again, when we convert everything to present value, you have your total present value life cycle costs. So we had our discounting and present value slide.
We talked about that.
Yeah, we already got that. So steps for conducting the LCCA. Again, this is covered in the guidance here. So first, you're going to establish your design alternatives. The model's set up to handle 4 of those. When you go through and you're going to define what those alternatives are, you're going to look at whether you're doing a regional distribution system or whether you're going to upgrade your own system. You would look at the different aspects that you would need to complete the project, what the various elements would be, and determine what the timing of those elements would be, when they would occur. So you'll have some items that would occur initially with construction. You'll determine your O&M, determine the timing of when you would do rehabilitation on certain items. So for example, like pipes might have a useful life of 50 years, whereas pump stations might have a useful life of only 20 years. So that's where you have to determine your timing of when you would actually do some of those cost items. Then once you have the timing of those, then you actually estimate what those costs would be for the different elements, including your initial construction costs, your rehabilitation, and your O&M. Then the next step is to compute what those life cycle costs are for each of the alternatives. And then you make a decision. So you compare all of the alternatives, look at the least costly alternative, and that's the one you want to go with. Any comments thoughts on that, Jay?
Yeah, he's getting into the pedantic step-by-step stuff here. There's a couple other things that in my notes that were kind of messed up I wanted to say. Economics isn't just in a capitalist society. Economics is in centrally planned economies. The former Soviet Union used economics when they allocated resources. North Korea uses economics. Everybody uses economics to allocate resources. It's not just in capitalist economy. And I challenge every one of you to think of a decision that you or someone else has made that was not an economic decision. And let me know when you think of one, because there aren't, I've never heard one yet. It wasn't an economic decision. You weigh the pros and the cons of alternatives, allocate your resources, and pick the output with the highest benefit to you.
Getting onto what Jay was saying, like in those other economies and those other government institutions, it's just who's making the decision, which is the differentiator. Yep. In capitalist economies, you holding the dollar are the ones making the decisions. In socialist economies, it's the government making the decision for the locals. So it's just who's making the decision. Anything else?
How are we going to stretch this out to a whole catfishing book here? I believe in good introductions. I mean, you're all thinking, why is he standing up there talking? Well, I already said I've got about 42 years. I wrote down a bunch of the things that I'd worked on. I worked on Devil's Lake. One of the very first things I did was, is it efficient to restore wetlands in the Devil's Lake Basin to reduce flooding in Devil's Lake? Well, it wasn't very efficient, because you restore all those potholes in all those fields to drop the water level by a couple inches. That was way, way back when. I worked on Beaver Creek a couple of years ago, where they wanted to impound the water in Beaver Creek to make a reservoir there. That didn't come out very well. I worked on Garrison. Oh, Devil's Lake, by the way, I've been run out of Devil's Lake several times for talking economics. I've worked on irrigation in Hungary, flooding in Bangladesh, low-intensity conflict in Colombia, tourism in Costa Rica, titanium mining in South Africa, as well as elephants and rhinos and flat dogs. Flat dog is a crocodile in Afrikaner. Hunting in New Zealand. Most recently, flooding of cropland in Norman County, which is part of the basis for what we're going to show you this afternoon. Norman County is on the Red River, North Dakota border, so we used some of that cropland stuff and applied it to North Dakota. So I didn't just start this yesterday, but it's still just as fun as it was when I started. And since Jeremy is going to get pedantic, unless we're going to go to questions?
We're going to go to questions next,
Okay.
Don.
Okay.
So at this point, we want to open it up. I think before we actually get into the model, we wanted to know what upfront questions you have about the guidance or potentially about the model, so that as we're going through, we can make sure we maybe address some of those. So let's start there. If anyone has any questions on the guidance or the model, raise your hand, we'll get you a mic. Nope. Here, you can talk into the mic.
So the current discount rate you're going to use is 2.875. Maybe the sponsor, the engineer, wants to use 2, or they want to use 6. I mean, what's the logic behind them not being able to make that change?
A low discount rate like today favors projects with high upfront costs and benefits spread over time. A high discount rate, like we had in the Carter years, is more beneficial to projects with the cost spread over time. You can use any discount rate you want, but 1% is kind of irrational. And as long as you're looking at the same project life for all your alternatives, it doesn't make, the big difference is when one project has all the costs up front and the benefits spread over time, and another project has the costs spread over time and the benefits spread over time. The low discount rate will favor the project with all the costs up front. The high discount rate will favor the project with it spread over time. And that's why we don't let engineers pick the discount rate, because they will pick the discount rate to support the project they want to build. The federal government every year says this is the discount rate that everybody will use for water projects. And right now it's 3%.
Yeah, and just adding to that too, there's a couple of other things about discounting. So first off, getting back to the issue of discounting, expanding on the reasons why we discount. There's a few reasons why we discount an economic analysis. There's one, the time value of money that Jay covered in terms of $1 today is not worth $1 tomorrow because of the investment opportunity of that dollar, that you can put it into a bank or earn a return on it. And so if I take that money back out in 5 years and I invest $1 today, I get $1.10 in 5 years based on that discount rate or the interest rate. The other thing is society's perception of time. Everyone wants something today versus tomorrow. We're altruistic about the future. So because of that, we discount future dollars. We also discount because of uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, right? So a lot of things can happen in the next few years. You can have inflation, you can have significant changes in the economy. So we don't want to treat, future years the same as today. So the more we get that discount rate closer to 1, we're saying tomorrow is equivalent today, and we don't know that that's going to happen because of uncertainty. So we always choose to go to a higher discount rate. The other thing to think about here is the discount rate that we're recommending here is comes out of the federal guidance, and it's based on the lending rate currently established by the federal bank. What do we all know just happened last week? The federal interest rate got raised 0.25%. And the Fed has already indicated the federal rate's going to go up again probably by the end of the year. So what does that mean here in terms of that 2.875? It's probably not going to be 2.875 next year. This discount rate is set every year by the Corps of Engineers, and it comes out of the President's Office of Management and Budget in terms of that they set the rate, and then the Corps interprets that and comes out with that 2.875. And we're at a historical low. We've been at a historical low now for 4 or 5 years, Jay? But we all know that rate's going to creep up. Is it going to hit 10 or 11% like we saw in the Carter years? No. Because they can only adjust the rate like 1/4 to 0.5% per year, it's going to take a while to get back there. But at the same time, this is not a value we're going to see for very long. So that rate is going to go back up. So when we think about all of those different things like uncertainty, how we perceive tomorrow, the borrowing power of $1, and when we're thinking about that in terms of costs, and we're thinking about a 50-year project, we want to make sure that the discount rate is a reasonable rate so that when you're comparing across projects, both at the state level, but even then at a local level, that you're comparing things at a reasonable basis. So choosing the discount rate is important, and making sure that we're not just driving something to 1 is an important thing to factor in when you're doing your life cycle cost analysis.
There are some arguments in the literature about a 0 discount rate.
Yep.
That we're not being fair to the future if we discount future values. Well, that doesn't work very good. What has the future ever done for us? We're making decisions in the present. We're not 50 years in the future. And it's not the Corps of Engineers, it's ERS, isn't it?
Right, right, yeah.
It sets the discount rate.
Yep.
And this is fun, the fun part.
So also, how do you know about the O&M rate if somebody doesn't influence their project by trying to change the O&M rate to make it a higher O&M than maybe it could be, because that influence the life cycle cost analysis then?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. And I think that's going to be really, on a review standpoint, one, providing reasonable documentation for what your O&M is going to include to the State Water Commission, I think is important. But also having some justification for what that O&M should include is, something you need to have. So it's not just like, hey, plug in a number, we're assuming 25,000. Well, where did that 25,000 per year come from, right? What is that based on? You should, any local utility should be able to have a general idea of what their operations and maintenance costs are, and be able to use that as a defendable basis to come up with like a water project.
Two things. There should be some sharp eyes in Pat's office that look at all of these benefit cost or efficiency analyses when they can come in and see if there's any fatal flaws. Like, this is really a dumb assumption. Let's change that assumption. The second thing, it would be best if we operated under a veil of ignorance. That's an economic concept where, we're always under a veil of ignorance. But if we had a project in Cass County, that should be evaluated by somebody from Burke County, not knowing where the project is, not knowing who's going to build the project, not knowing who's going to engineer the project. Then they're going to do a fair analysis. The engineer that's going to build the project, design the project, shouldn't be the one doing the analysis if they're going to be coming up with a bunch of wild-ass assumptions just to make the project look like it's good. Somebody separate from the project should be doing the analysis under a veil of ignorance, not knowing where it is, who it's going to benefit. Then we get a nice, honest assessment. But we'll assume that for the time being, the folks doing the analyses will be doing an honest assessment with Pat's office sharp eyes looking for those crazy assumptions.
Should there be a table of guidance for that kind of thing, given like rates and?
I've thought about that a little bit, and I think O&M is one of those items that and Jay, I guess you can disagree with me here if you think, but my experience, at least from dealing with projects across the country, various life cycle cost analyses and benefit cost analyses, O&M is always somewhat different depending on the project, and it's very tough to come up with a standard table for things like O&M. We've tried to standardize the model, and simplify it as much as we could for things like calculating replacement and rehabilitation schedules, but O&M is something that's highly variable and project dependent, so it's tough to come up with like a generalized table. I mean, we could come up with, if it gets to a point, we could come up with like unit values, but you'd still have to come up with like quantities and hours associated with what those O&M activities would be to estimate something.
And I can't disagree because we agreed not to disagree before we started. You know what you'd get if you lined up all the economists in the world end to end? Well, you still wouldn't have an agreement. So
we can disagree this time if you think
okay.
different.
No.
No.
Just do what's reasonable.
Yep.
Somebody will be watching.
I think the point of this exercise, though, too, with the LCCA is to simplify it enough that it shouldn't be overly complicated. The application for the funding, your cost estimates, aren't overly complicated. This model isn't necessarily overly complicated. So an O&M estimate is something you should be able to come up with. The model's already going to calculate like replacement value and salvage value for you. So really the O&M estimate should be kind of taken with the same grain of salt and same level of effort as what you did for the rest of the application. Have a reasonable estimate, back it up with whatever available data you have, an engineer or a local consultant or the regional water distribution system that you're connecting into should be able to give you a value of what that O&M measure would be. For example, like O&M, one way of measuring O&M could even be based on if you're connecting into a regional water distribution system, there's already a rate that would be paid for O&M. Have the regional water distribution system give you what that O&M that is going into what that rate is. What is the incremental increase in your rate going to be based on for O&M? So somewhere there should be a value for that. And it's just a matter of just getting at that in a very simple, very straightforward way without putting too much effort into it, if that makes sense.
And if everybody uses the same tool, that eliminates some problems. Back in, who was water commissioner in 1985? Was that Vern Fay? Okay. Back in 1985, they would get hundreds of projects into the Water Commission, and they would, Spry was in the back room then doing some engineering. They'd give him 10 projects to analyze. They'd give another person 10, another person 10, another person 10, another person 10. And they all used a different process. Well, that doesn't work very well. So back in 1985, they asked somebody at NDSU to come up with a standard procedure to do cost-benefit analysis of North Dakota water projects. And that's here. Pat can get you get you copies of that. It hasn't changed. This was 1985. The procedure hasn't changed. If we all use the same tool, if the tool has a few glitches, it doesn't matter. If you have a bathroom scale here that's 20 pounds off, and we weigh everybody in the room, we still know who weighs the most and who weighs the least. The scale was 20 pounds off. That doesn't really matter. Use the same tool, similar assumptions. Don't quibble about some of the details.
That applies to both comparing across applicants and also within projects. So if you're one applicant and you're trying to compare across your 4 alternatives, it doesn't matter if you're off, as Jay was saying, by 30 pounds, because all of your alternatives would be off by 30 pounds. If each of you in the room is doing a separate project application, and we're comparing across each of your applications, all of your applications are off by 30 pounds, so it doesn't matter. We know whose is the best, or least cost.
We're not suggesting that the models are off.
No, we're not.
But if they were, if you had that inclination to think they were off, it doesn't really matter.
Well, I guess the other way to think of it is because we have simplified the process, the model's automating some of those calculations for you. Everyone is getting automated in the same way. Everyone is being simplified in the same way in terms of the calculation. So it's an order of magnitude. So, yeah. Jeff, can you pass the mic across over here?
Thanks, buddy. Hello, hello. Well, I agree with that analysis. If we understood a little bit better how you're going to analyze the results of this. For example, my biggest concern about this process is that smaller communities, smaller counties, their cost analysis, the LCCA or the economic analysis of the process, might not show as great of a benefit. But if we understand what the standard is that's going to allow that project to be then accepted into the queue, then what you're saying I agree with. However, if that parameter is not met and the larger communities are going to be able to probably meet or exceed those parameters very easily, and it's the smaller communities, smaller projects, if you will, that might not show as great an economic analysis. And that's my fear. Where does that evaluation start? In other words, what gets you into the queue? If we understand that, then what you're saying, we can apply that to see if there's any kind of detriment for being small. You know what I'm saying?
I think that's above our pay grade and above our current charge. The Water Commission was told by the legislature to do economic efficiency analysis and provide that information.
But the reason why I bring it up this morning is because you just said it doesn't matter if you're 30 pounds off or whatever the measurement is. And I'm saying that it depends on what the queue is. What is the break-off point? Because in smaller communities, smaller counties, that might make all the difference. That difference, that if we all do the same, it might take them out of the running. And so...
Well, there's no running at this point.
Well...
All they're doing is providing with the application an efficiency analysis.
So...
I get it. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, one of the things with life cycle cost analysis is it's not like a benefit cost metric where we're looking for like a return of 1.0, meaning you get $1 for every dollar of cost you invested. In this case, I think with life cycle cost analysis, the efficiency test is just making sure that you, the applicant, have evaluated all of the alternatives and are putting forward your best alternative that is coming at the least cost, maximizing the use of public dollars. That's really the test here. And Pat, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, or Garland, that's really what you're looking for in the application, right?
Yeah, there's no benefit component to the LCCA. It's just cost.
And the floor, if I remember correctly, is projects greater than $1 million.
Yes.
So there will be some, I agree with what David said, there will be some smaller communities, lots of smaller communities that will come in with projects, but because of the water output or distribution that they need, those projects are going to be probably less than $1 million.
Just as a reminder, so the life cycle cost analysis does not have that $1 million threshold. The way the legislation was written, it's just, right now it says municipal water supply projects. The $1 million only refers to, within the legislation, the economic analysis. Okay.
Any other questions or points?
So earlier you showed that those curves of indifference or whatever they were that were coming the opposite way. And if you have two projects, one that's getting a benefit of bringing the city or a community a better quality water, and the other one is leaving somebody with still high iron in their water, but it gets them wet water, do you bring forth both projects underneath this LCAA, or only the ones, do you only bring forward within the LCAA the one that meets kind of the benefits to the city that they are looking for?
I don't quite get the question you answered.
So, yeah,
Not
so,
equal products.
okay, so one of the issues with the LCCA, though, is you're looking for equivalent product. So, I guess maybe Pat or Jeff, do you guys have any thoughts on how you'd want to handle that from an application standpoint? Because part of that might be an application issue too, because with LCCA, you're assuming that you're delivering the same quality and quantity of water here, and then you're comparing it, because otherwise you would need some kind of tertiary treatment on the water as it's, you know, to make sure that the iron content would be like equivalent.
Right, so, you know, I don't know for sure exactly what the commission will all ask for, but my assumption would be is that they would want to have information on the various alternatives that were brought forward to be, you know, to be looked at quantitatively, and if there are additional pieces to that puzzle that they should consider. For example, if there are water quality issues between a couple of different alternatives, I would think that that would be something that we would want to also put before them to use in their decision making.
So is that, I guess maybe getting to this, there's the LCCA, which is going to be part of the application. And then there's the other part of the application, which you already have, which is the application that shows the project cost, description of the project. So maybe there's some other parts of the application that would provide that justification of like why we selected this particular project that we're actually applying for, right? So that is like even though the cost is higher or maybe lower, we're selecting this one. You know, here's the LCCA that shows what the cost of the various alternatives are, but we're still asking for funding on this particular one because the product water is better, for example.
This is probably more a question for Pat and staff, but I'm going back to Jeffrey's question and point on using a standard discount rate. Are we going to have annual updates to the model or to that guidance to be able to standardize that across the state?
Yeah, well, I mean, every year that it changes, we'll update the model and the guidance to deal with those changes.
The updated discount rates appear every October. So because it's based on the federal fiscal year, so the guidance memo comes out in October. Or actually, I guess it's a month prior to October, so they can anticipate those changes. And then what would happen then is the model would be updated for the calendar year, probably based on that guidance. So, you know, we're using right now the discount rate for fiscal year 18, which is coming to an end. The 19 discount rate will be available in, say, September, October. The model could be updated for calendar year 19.
But a 1/4 or a 0.5% discount rate isn't going to make or break anything. Not going to make a difference.
Yep. It's going to be kind of rounding error changes at this point for that kind of change. So if we were talking like going from 2.875 to 7%, that'd be a whole other thing.
That's a big deal.
Just, Jeremy.
Yes.
One other thing that was mentioned, it was, I think, maybe somewhat clear in the discussion, but maybe to make it very clear, is that, you know, the guidance and model that they're talking about today is for life cycle cost analysis. That element of financial analysis, that's something that is not part of what we were asked to do with this effort when it comes to, you know, can you or should you, you know, move forward in paying for a project. For every project sponsor, their financial situation is different. The different tools, funding sources that you may access to pay for those projects can be different. That's something that's a separate issue, a separate process that is different from this.
Yeah, and Pat, I would just add to that too. There are federal agencies out there, for example, like with EPA. If you're doing a water supply project, a clean drinking water project, and you're, as an applicant, you're going to be going to the State Water Commission, you're doing your LCCA to get funding here, and maybe you're also, you have a project that like, hey, this is really going to improve rural water supply, you're going to EPA for funding. EPA has an ability to pay analysis that has to be applied for as part of their application process. So that is not part of this State Water Commission program, though. The LCCA is simply the economic analysis, nothing financial related to it. So ability to pay, bonding, rate studies, none of that is what we're looking at here. That, I guess the one thing I would say, getting back to Jeff's question about O&M, though, it doesn't mean that like a rate study can't help inform what you're doing here. Like rates can be a basis for helping to establish what that O&M could be. For example, like again, as I talked about before, like a regional water district, if you're connecting into them and you're paying a rate, that rate has an O&M built into it. So why not use that information to back into an O&M estimate? Anyone else? Why don't we take a 15-minute break, everyone get coffee, whatnot, and then we'll get very pedantic, as Jay was saying, and get into the model and go through an example and have some more questions. So before we continue and get into the example, we had a little discussion here about one of the questions that we had right before the break here regarding the quality of water being delivered and compared in LCCA. And so just to address that question a little bit further, we had some discussion, and from the aspect of the way this would be used and what the State Water Commission would be looking for is when you're thinking about the alternatives being evaluated, there's two aspects here. We're assuming that in the LCCA that the water or the benefits of the project are equivalent. So that means both quantity and quality. Quantity standpoint, that's pretty straightforward. We're assuming that the amount of water being delivered by the project are the same. So if it's like a 100 MGD project, all the alternatives are designed for 100 MGD. For quality, the standard that, as we discussed with Jeff, is really that the project would be meeting, for example, like clean water drinking regulations. So there are clean water standards set forth, and that those have ranges of criteria for different chemicals and nutrients in the water, and as long as all of the alternatives are within the same range, though we can assume that the benefits are within those ranges, we can assume that the benefits of being delivered by the project's alternatives are the same. So for example, if there's, I guess, Jeff, do you have some additional comments on that in terms of, Jay, can you get Jeff the mic? I was just thinking, Jeff, if you wanted to just expand what you were telling me in terms of like the quality of the water a little bit here.
The primary standards, of course, are pretty straightforward in meeting all those. Most projects will meet those, whether the alternative is from one source or another source. But then to also look at the secondary standards, you know, whether it's the TDS, iron, manganese, all those kind of basic parameters, if they're within those same limits. And there's no question, as everybody knows, in North Dakota, it varies quite a bit across the state. But the only issue becomes probably more for a system that has softened water versus not softened water. Of course, that cost, there's a big difference between those two, but somehow provide information that it is equivalent water. There may be a benefit to you to provide softened water, but to try and show the cost without that softened option, if that's possible. So you kind of keep them on the same plane, if that makes sense.
Hold on just a second, if we can get you the mic here so you can.
You talked about the Safe Drinking Water Act and the primary standards, but what about those that fall under the secondary standards? The ones that the benefits that the customers do see, the aesthetics, the higher iron, some of those things that really aren't maybe a health hazard, but are more aesthetics that your customers are going to see.
And like you said, there is guidelines for the secondary standards too, ranges of what they recommend towards, so it would just have to be in that range.
So I'm going to walk through an example here of how, of putting the LCCA into practice. This is actually using an example provided by the State Water Commission that we've basically piloted through the model. We've had to come up with a couple of assumptions here in terms of O&M, which I'll just talk to here. But so this example, we're calling it local city here, is thinking about upgrading their distribution center or distribution system. And they're comparing two alternatives. The first alternative is to replace their existing distribution system with a new updated system. They would manage the system themselves because they don't have much experience with managing their distribution center or system. They would have to hire a consultant to help with that, like an owner's operator, and the cost to construct this system is about $1 million. The second alternative is they already purchase a large amount of water from a regional water district. They would work with the regional water district and have them replace and manage the system at a reduced cost of approximately $328,000 in terms of construction. Alternative one, they would design the system to reduce their long-term O&M. And under alternative two, though, we're assuming because the regional water district is already in operation, they already have trained staff to operate and maintain the existing system. There's even a smaller increase in O&M with alternative two. So I'll walk through how we built this into the model. And if you have the model up, you can kind of follow along and see where we plugged information in here. So let me get out of PowerPoint here. Back to Excel. Okay. So when you open the model, you have the title page, the how-to, which explains the purpose of the model, how to use the LCCA model in terms of where data goes into. And as the guidance explains, really, in terms of the way you operate the model, you have two spreadsheets where you actually input data. You have the inputs spreadsheet where you enter basic information, the analysis year of the project. So for example, we're doing a 2018 project, so we would enter data about 2018. You enter your descriptions of the alternatives you're going to be evaluating, the O&M, and the length of construction of the project. Pretty straightforward in terms of the inputs. And then you have your detailed costs worksheet where you would have come up with your detailed cost estimate. You're going to assign cost category, or you're going to assign each of those detailed costs to functional cost categories, and then the model does the rest to calculate the expected life or useful life of those equipment and infrastructure, and then uses that also to further calculate replacement value, rehabilitation cycle, and the salvage value, if any, on those items. And then you have the other worksheets. For example, you have a results summary that gives you the breakdown of the total present value costs. And if you want to walk through and see how the model's doing the calculations, you have the LCCA worksheet, which gives you a detailed year-by-year breakdown of the present value costs. and then all the background calculations occur in worksheets 5 and 6. So getting back to our two alternatives here, let me scroll up here on this page. So first off, as I mentioned, there's a couple things you need to plug in here. So first, we have a base year for the LCCA model period of analysis. And again, because we're doing this project in 2018, we plug in a year value of 2018. If we were doing this for, say, 2019, we would plug in 2019. The year is pretty much going to be set to, you're pretty much going to be entering in a current year. Notice, though, that the cells here, the gray cells, are ones that are hard-coded. So, for example, we're doing a 50-year period of analysis. So if you plug in 2018, the model is going to run through 2068. The discount factor is automatically applied at 2.875%, and we note the source here. So getting back to the question earlier about updating the discount factor, for next year, 2019, we would update that discount factor, and we would obviously note that the source has changed, so that EGM would be changed to 1901 for fiscal year 19. And then for the volume of water being provided, this project provides 4.38 thousand gallons per day. And then we have, scrolling down here, so we have our two project descriptions. So alternative 1, city is looking to replace their existing water system. We have a description of what the elements of the project are and the justification for it. Notice here that the total construction cost in yellow, that's a calculation which comes from the detailed cost estimate. So we don't have to do anything there. We're assuming this project would take 1 year to implement. And the annual O&M, again, because the new system hopefully should be easier to maintain, is going to take about $50,000 in annual O&M costs. So then we named our second alternative, alternative 2. We could have easily named it regional water distribution connection. We have the description here. So the city is currently a bulk user of the regional water district. The city has aging infrastructure throughout the city and is having to fix consistent breaks in their distribution center, or system. Sorry, I keep saying center, I don't know why. Cities asked the regional water district to install a distribution system throughout the city and change the residents to individual users rather than bulk users. And the project would abandon the existing distribution system and replace it with a new branch-style distribution system to serve the residents of the town of Local. So the cost is $328,000 total construction cost. Again, this project was estimated to have 1 year of construction. And again, in this case, we're assuming here that it's $25,000 in O&M. So what we assumed here, because we didn't have an O&M estimate, but we assumed that in this case, getting back to the example I talked about before, City of Local, when they come up with this estimate, they would work with the regional water district and say, hey, tell us what this incremental O&M is going to be in terms of rates. And then we can back into what that annual O&M estimate and use that to compare to our alternatives. So just before I move past this worksheet, you've got room here to do 4 alternatives. In this particular project example, we only have 2, but you can do four alternatives, and I think that's a reasonable number of alternatives here, because say if you had like 8 alternatives, well, the issue with 8 alternatives is you're probably going to screen some of those out ahead of time before you even get to doing this LCCA, right? You would have screened it down to a reasonable number of alternatives. So 4 is probably a nice number here. And that's, I think, from the feedback we've received thus far, 4 is probably okay. We haven't heard that you should need to evaluate more. So then we get into the detailed cost estimate worksheet, and I did not zoom in on this, so let me do that here. Okay. So, getting back to the total cost, this yellow cell is the one that links over to the inputs worksheet, and it's taking the sum of all of the costs here in this worksheet. So we have mobilization, quantity of one, unit cost, total cost, and we do that for each of the different project components. So we have remove existing water main, 10-inch aggregate surface course, 6-inch water main, service connections, service laterals, all of this to replace the existing distribution center system. All right. And then for each of these different categories, we've assigned a cost category to it. So we have a large list of cost categories here that can be selected from. So for example, there is a mobilization category. We've assumed that removing the existing system falls under your demo and abandonment. Pipelines, we have pipeline for the 10-inch, main lines for the 6-inch water main, distribution lines, and then we plugged this in one in as other, but we probably also could have used distribution lines here. I'll go ahead and I'll make that change here for the service laterals. Okay. And you'll notice that when you do that, for example, if I change from, going from other, you'll notice the useful life changes here. So a lot of these values, as I mentioned here, the cost category has a specific useful life assigned to it. Mobilization, demo, abandonment doesn't have a useful life. You're taking infrastructure out. However, some physical equipment and infrastructure does have a useful life with it. For example, we're assuming 20 years on pipeline appurtenances. Main lines have a useful life of 50 years, so that's going to run out all the way through this 50-year period of analysis. Distribution lines have a shorter useful life of 35 years, and as I change this one to distribution lines, it will also get updated to 35 years. So what does that mean here in terms of what that is changing in the model? So the 35 years is being used to calculate rehabilitation. So for example, here, what the model does is it takes the construction cost as a proxy for rehabilitation cost. So at 35 years in the future, the model is assuming here that the $67,200 gets repeated at 35 years in the model. Now that's in terms of future value costs, and then we discount those to present value. So what the model sees, and I'll kind of walk through this when I get to the worksheet, but you'll see that the $67,200 is not the value that's in the final number because we're discounting it back to present value. And then at the end of 35 years, or at the end of 50 years here, we're also assuming a salvage value on equipment and infrastructure. So 35 years minus 50 leaves you 15 years of depreciated value that or actually no, it's the other way around here. So yeah, 15 years of depreciated value we're taking off of the rehabilitated pipelines, and then we're factoring that as a salvage value on the life cycle cost analysis. Now we have a second alternative here. Again, same thing, detailed cost estimate. We have quantities, linear feet, unit cost, get us to a total cost for each of the elements. We've got distribution lines, valves, pipeline appurtenances, mobilization, cathodic protection, other. And so each of these has a useful life. So all of that gets entered, and you get the total construction cost. And then I'll just kind of jump over here to the LCCA worksheet and what this is doing in the background, and then we'll move over to the summary. So as I mentioned here, the model is using this information. You can see here, because we have 1 year of construction on both alternatives, in year one, you get the full value of that $107,900, so roughly 1.1 million, and then on alternative two, 328,000. Just real quick, I want to show if we were to change this to 2 years of construction on this particular project, say that the city of local realizes as they get into this that actually, because they're having to manage this, that it would actually take them 2 years to implement the entire project. If we go back to the LCCA worksheet, it's a pretty straightforward calculation. The model is just dividing those costs and spreading them over 2 years. Again, this is a simplified assumption. In reality, if you're doing a detailed cost estimate, we might have phasing of those costs, but we've simplified that here. Yeah, Pat. Jay, can you pass? Oh, you've already got a mic.
Just maybe one other thing to mention on the previous entry sheet.
This one?
No, the next one. With the useful life, if for whatever reason there are different useful life estimates that you want to use, you can actually enter those in, correct?
Yep.
We just would ask
so I
that
can just
you-
come in here and override it.
Right, we just ask that you include some notes as to why that would be.
Yep, so we do have this notes. Thanks for reminding me of that. Yes, you can override the values. So if you're going to do anything like that, obviously when you're going to be passing the model off to the State Water Commission. They're going to take a look at what you plugged in and why, and they would come in here and take a look at this and say, oh, okay, you know what, you actually changed this value. They'd be looking for a set of notes as to like why you're justifying the change here. Could be something as simple as, well, we know like with the soil or geotech issue that we're going to have to get in there sooner to rehab this pipeline. So, but again, the idea here is that the model is automated enough. Hopefully, you don't have to do too much of that. So again, here. Couple things to think about though. If the construction of the project is now spread over 2 years, these are your nominal undiscounted dollars. So if we scroll down here on this worksheet, we have two sets. So up here are your nominal dollars, and then down here, when we scroll down, we get to the discounted base. Notice that the 539,700 is the discount factor is 1.0 for your first year, and then the second year, if we think back to calculating present value, that discount factor that we apply is 0.97 using this discount factor, and we apply that to the cost. So your actual capital costs decrease slightly in terms of present value. Why do I say this? This really could play into things. We have $328,000 in costs here. If this project took 10 years to implement, one, it's gonna delay your operations and maintenance, but it's also going to discount the construction costs. So like if I go in here and change this to 10 years. I'm not saying that this is reality, I just want to show how this works here. Notice now that our capital costs have decreased from 1.1 million to 953 in terms of present value costs. So, and also our O&M decreases because our O&M is now deferred into the future when the project's completed. And actually that puts our annual O&M, even though the O&M is higher. So at $50,000 on annual O&M with alternative one and 25,000 here, notice how much closer the annual O&M are if you defer or if you have a 10-year construction versus a 1-year construction. So again, I just wanted to show kind of in practice how this works or how discounting can affect some of those cost streams. It doesn't necessarily mean that now the alternatives are going to cost the same, but it is going to change some of the cost stream quite a bit. Okay, so then let's see here. Kind of walking through a few other things. As I talked about here, the model based on its useful life is calculating the rehabilitation and replacement costs of equipment. So if we scroll across here, we probably have to get to about 25 years, but then we'll see a blip right here. Now we start to see some of those costs appear as the model's calculating replacement costs based on the useful life we plugged in. So we get a blip here, and those are discounted, because if we go back up the real dollars. This is your undiscounted cost. So it was 146,200 or 148,200 in terms of nominal, and 84,000 when discounted. Looking right here. Let me zoom in on this a little bit more. Oh, there we go. Maybe that's a little bit better. Okay. And then salvage value is 0 until you get to the very end. So that's too much. Go back here. So we go all the way across, we get to the last year, and notice that's when we have the salvage value pop in. And again, that's based on the depreciation factored in, assuming the useful life of equipment. So if you have 50-year useful life, you'll have a salvage value essentially of 0 on those equipment. If you have a 35-year useful life, then you're going to have a rehab cycle on that cost, and then you're going to calculate depreciation between your 35 and year 50, and that residual that depreciated value gets entered in, or the total value minus the depreciated value is what comes in on the salvage value, and then that's discounted. Okay. And if you want to see how all that's calculated, that's all happening in this background worksheet here, which I'm not going to go through, but you're welcome to look through it. So then, okay, so you've done this, so what? And I thought I zoomed in on all these, but apparently not. So what does all this mean? Okay, so again, this worksheet right here, worksheet 4, the LCCA, is your discounted summary present value costs. So if you didn't want to go through the LCCA worksheet and see all the nominal stuff, this is your summary right here showing the present value cost stream of each of the alternatives, roughly at a 3% discount factor. Again, 2.875. And again, we have the 1 year construction, we have our O&M, and these are rounded. And then we have our rehab. We have some more rehab. More rehab. And then we have salvage value. All of those costs get added up here for each year. So we have a total present value cost for each year. And then we have we have a present value cost for each year, and then we have the total present value cost over the 50-year life of the project. So we take that, bring it over to our results summary. Okay, so putting it all together, alternative 1, if you recall, was the city doing its own distribution system. Alternative 2 was connecting into a regional water distribution system. There's going to be annual O&M of $50,000 per year for alternative 1, which total present value cost-wise, when we factor in discounting, that $50,000 becomes roughly $1.3 million that the city would incur in costs over 50 years. And alternative 2, again, thinking back to what Jay was saying earlier, it's cost to whoever pays them to wherever they occur. So in this case, the regional water distribution system, or the regional water district, is incurring a cost of $653,000, which does, if you're thinking about a financial analysis, get passed on to ratepayers, in terms of individual ratepayers. They would incur that cost of $653,000 over the next 50 years. Then there's going to be rehab costs that occur that the city would bear the costs at $188,000. Alternative 2, all of these costs are being borne by the regional water district in terms of the construction and the rehab. and then there's salvage value that are almost the same here, 32,000 versus 28,000. So the total present value costs, they're obviously an order of magnitude different. So the city going alone and doing their own new distribution system will cost the city and the local payers roughly $2.5 million versus alternative one, which will come out to be roughly $1.1 million, which is actually pretty close to the, well, it's the same number almost when we round as the capital costs here from alternative one, which is kind of an interesting result here that I didn't even plan on. Now, if we take that and break it down to per 1,000 gallons per day, that gives us another metric that could be used to compare across other projects here. So when we break this down to the amount of water being provided per day, it's roughly $580,000 per 1,000 gallons per day versus $250,000 per gallon per day in present value costs. So alternative two, as this present value calculation, the life cycle cost analysis shows, is the cheaper alternative to go with. If you wanted to look at where these cost streams come in.
Jeremy,
Yep,
these were two boring alternatives.
they are, aren't they?
I could have told you when you showed me the first slide which one was the better deal.
Well, I had to walk through all the figures, didn't I?
You know, there's three kinds of people when it comes to math: those who get it and those who don't. It would have been a much more interesting example if the occurrence of costs were different between the two.
Right.
But as you can see from these charts, they're both kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
So it's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think in a lot of cases, when you do a lot of life cycle cost analysis, that is really the case. You have one alternative that really stands out. It should be a no-brainer on paper, but you still have to put it down just to see how it works. I do a lot of asset management stuff too. So we do a lot of life cycle cost analyses for those types of projects. And sometimes there's one alternative that's really close to another alternative, but other times they are pretty much no-brainers. And that's part of the reason why life cycle cost analysis is a pretty straightforward exercise usually to go through. And the other thing I'd add to this is really more of an engineering exercise as much as an economic exercise. The economics are pretty straightforward, as Jay and I have talked about here. Doing the engineering is kind of the hard work. You have to come up with the construction costs. You have to think about the alternatives, where you would run distribution lines, what the timing of those things would be. That's really where the hard work comes in on the life cycle cost analysis. Getting to this point, it's really straightforward putting it together. And then ultimately, kind of getting to Jay's point here, the results are pretty straightforward. It's really easy usually to see close examples. Now, where this might be different is if we had a project, if we just make a couple changes here, what if the O&M actually was higher for the regional water district? What if it was $100,000 per year? Does that make a change? Jay, any guesses?
Absolutely.
How much? We're testing his math skills here.
3 times.
3 times. There you go. Notice how we went from 1 million to 3 million. O&M has a big role in affecting.
What, it went from 1 million to 3 million?
What's that?
1 million to 3 million?
Yep.
That's 3 times.
Yeah, it's 3 times. That's there you go. Jay was right. O&M does play an important part in life cycle cost analysis, and that I think is really kind of one of the things to think about here is making a decision at a local level. A lot of times you get focused on just the capital cost of a project. And the whole point of life cycle cost analysis in this exercise is to think about all of the costs, to whomever they occur, whenever they occur, and making sure that those are captured in the decision-making process. Making sure from an efficiency standpoint that the best decision is being made with the use of public funds that are available. O&M is an important driver of a life cycle cost analysis. And that's where I think thinking about this decision-making framework is important because, you know, we made the case here that, okay, regional water district, the truth of the matter is the regional water district already has laborers in place, they already have trained staff, their O&M, unless of course they're putting in some very sophisticated technology that may require a lot more maintenance, but technically that shouldn't be the case because usually when we think about technology, it reduces costs, it reduces maintenance and labor, like with SCADA systems, things like that. Costs should actually decrease with the regional water district. So that's the reason why we assume $25,000, and that's the reason why alternative 2 is a no-brainer on paper, even before you put it in the LCCA. It's just a matter of documenting it with that case. But if we think about scenarios where O&M could be higher, and I'm trying to think of one, Jay, do you have any thoughts on where an O&M could be much higher? Yeah, I can't come up with one off the top of my head, but if there is a case where O&M is much higher, again, when we're thinking about this present value stream of costs, the answer could be easily flipped from what you're thinking. And so that's really the LCCA exercise in answering those questions. So with that, I guess I would open it up to questions about the model, where you might enter things, any questions on the guidance that maybe kind of came up from this exercise, how you might handle particular data inputs. Anyone? Has everyone been, can I get a show of hands, has everyone been through the model before this? Couple? Will you all go back and try out the model before you actually get to a project? Maybe. Well, with that, let's see here. It's 11 o'clock. Should we break for lunch and we'll come back after that for the EA?
Jeremy,
Yeah.
what happens if the regional water authority, after year 2, after you've dismantled your municipal system, if they double the price? They got you.
Well, that's the financial analysis. That's not part of this. I guess the only thing, well, I guess the thing to think about is, are they doubling the price, or is the O&M actually gone up?
No, they're just doubling the price.
That's more on why did you connect to the regional water distribution system. That's more a negotiation with ratepayers or the district in terms of what rates are being paid. So.
This one is too easy. Anybody? Don't let him get off so easy. Everybody's hungry. It's only 11 o'clock.
No one?
You know, the example my mind works in strange ways. I was thinking of, if you're going to buy a car, you buy a Hyundai and it goes 200,000 miles with zero maintenance. Or you buy a cheap Ford, which is cheaper up front, but you spend all kinds of money maintaining for the next 200,000 miles. That's kind of what this analysis does. Yeah. It shows locals what they're getting into. Are you buying a Hyundai that lasts a long time, or are you buying a Ford that you have to fix all the time? Still, with the Ford, if the discounted value of the fixes in total is cheaper than the price of the Hyundai, the Ford is a better deal. But that's the whole purpose of LCCA, is to show you what you're getting into over the life cycle of a project.
I guess I would add to that too. It used to be Mercedes. Mercedes are really expensive cars, right?
Not really.
Well, it depends. Compared to a Hyundai, Mercedes, the upfront costs are really expensive, 2-3 times the cost. Hyundai have low maintenance, but Mercedes used to actually be the most reliable car out there in terms of maintenance, long-term reliability. You could drive a Mercedes 250,000 miles and the engine was basically bulletproof.
I put 300,000 on a 240.
Yeah, yeah. And then they would still have a high residual value too. You could still trade them in and get a really good trade-in value, $10,000, $15,000 on a Mercedes. What do you trade a Hyundai in for? Anyone?
Scrap.
Scrap. So you might have low maintenance on your Hyundai, but it's got no value at the end. And thinking about discounting and comparing it to that Mercedes, now you've got a trade-in value, a residual value of $15,000. You've had low maintenance, and you've had a higher upfront cost. So which one is more costly? Which one's the better value?
We have to use your model.
Right. But a lot of times what was actually shown, like I know like reading like Car and Driver, is that Mercedes actually had the better value because of that, because of the residual value. When you think about present value calculations, the Mercedes actually, if you calculate out the life of the car, Mercedes is a better investment. But again, you don't think about that up front because all you're thinking about is the car buyer. A lot of times you're just thinking about how much am I paying for it at the dealership.
The financial analysis says you can't afford that Mercedes up front.
Right,
The economic analysis says you should buy it.
right. Well, salvage value is the residual value that's going to maybe, like if you're able to sell things for scrap, can you reuse some of the materials? Those are the things that play into the future costs of like a next project, right? It basically offsets some of your costs over the life cycle of a
And
project.
it accounts for some of the lumpiness of the inputs.
Right.
If you have something that lasts 35 years and you redo it at year 35, you only use 15 years of it by the end.
Yeah.
So you need to capture that
Yeah, you need to
35
capture
years
the
that you didn't
residual from the
use.
depreciation. Pat, you're going to say something? Oh, I saw you grabbing the mic.
And I was just going to say they could be positive or they could be negative.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we got a question back here.
Just say you happen to have 3 Hyundais.
Okay.
Both of them, let's say 2 of them were made in the middle of the week. One was made on Friday afternoon.
Oh boy.
A different alternative, let's just say that you have cities A and city B. They've got both the same equipment, both the same dollar amount. City B has some complications as far as like maybe lightning strikes, several locations, destroys a water tower and the infrastructure with it. I know insurance would be probably helping out in a situation like that, but there is good luck and bad luck in something like that. I just wanted to throw that scenario in there, I guess.
I would answer that by saying there's risk and there's uncertainty.
Yep.
Risk, you can guess the probability of. Uncertainty is events like lightning strike that you have no idea
Yep.
about building that into your model. You build risk in there, uncertainty, you just roll the dice.
Yeah, so kind of another example of that, or another way of thinking about that. Risks are the things that we know. Uncertainty are the things that we can't quantify. We know that they might happen, but we don't know when. We don't know what the likelihood of those are. And so we try and generalize what some probability of them occurring might be. Some of those factors might get built into your upfront costs. For example, like earthquakes. When I work on the West Coast and even sometimes the East Coast, we have seismic zones that you have to deal with. So those factors get built into your construction costs, right? So your construction cost is going to include additional seismic retrofits, and you try and account for those risks and uncertainties as best you can in both your construction costs. When we think about asset management then and O&M, some of those factors get built into our operations and maintenance in terms of an expected value of maybe maintenance and associated repairs associated with like a minor earthquake occurring that might require annual crack repairs. or going out and monitoring pipes to make sure that, and doing inspections on pipes to perhaps do additional replacements. And so one of the things I would point out here is that obviously we've simplified the model and how we handle a life cycle cost analysis. If I'm doing like an asset management program where I'm doing a very detailed life cycle cost analysis, we would actually have breakdowns for each asset, for each equipment, what the operations and maintenance activities are associated with those, and we would have like line items for like seismic and other like risks and uncertainties that we would account for in the analysis. Things like the lightning, you just don't know. And so maybe you don't put a dollar value on it, and it's one of those unknown costs that can come up in life cycle analysis. Here we've generalized this, so your O&M is one estimate, but you could still build some of those, or some of those items should still be built into what you're assuming in terms of O&M. Jay, anything to add to that? Any additional thoughts?
You know, my mind works in mysterious ways. I was thinking about for every $1.5 billion in heavy construction costs in this country, there's one fatality. That's based on statistics. How is that covered in these costs? Well, that's pretty easy. It's covered by the insurance premiums that the contractor pays. So some of those things that you might think about are in there somewhere.
Yeah, they're buried in the construction cost somewhere.
Yep.
Or in your annual O&M as part of your maintenance costs, your labor, part of your labor costs assumes some of those insurance costs in your overhead.